All right, so we talked yesterday about the readiness phase, phase one. This morning we talked about the response phase, that immediate phase right after the disaster. And now we're going to move into talking about the recovery phase, which is that long-term recovery effort where you're now trying to restore operations in your portfolio to how it was pre-disaster. So the recovery phase under the D3R guidebook really focuses on the identification of needs of your property and your residents and determining the resources that are available. So this is why it can be so important to be familiar with the funding sources that are out there and what might fit your needs as you move into recovery, and considering like a strategic approach to what you need and what funding sources you can use towards that and what some eligible uses of the funding would be. So one thing we're going to keep coming back to, and we've already been coming back to it quite a bit, is coordination and partnerships. So throughout the recovery, all those previously established and even some of those newly established partnerships are going to come into play because they can still be an excellent resource for assistance to your PHA, advocacy, and information sharing. So it doesn't necessarily mean the relationship has to end once that like immediate emergency period is over. And some best practices just to consider during recovery: continuing to either establish or reconfirm roles and responsibilities within your PHA. This is to enhance coordination and communication within your own team. Assessing any recent events to identify what went well and where you have an opportunity for improvement. Implementing opportunities for increased resilience of your portfolio, which we have talked about before. Identifying some gaps in your partnerships and coordination. So maybe you realize through the response process that maybe there are some gaps where you could use assistance from another agency. And just continue to foster those existing partnerships to solidify them into more long-term relationships. So recovery activities involve, oh, go ahead.
So what do you mean by prioritize environmentally responsibility? Last point.
Oh. So yeah, we'll get to that, but essentially what it means is rather than just restoring it back to how it was, if there's the ability to consider the environmental impact, same as we've kind of talked about equity, the importance of considering equity of the community, consideration of the environment can be an important aspect. And this can be something that is more done in the planning phase. We can go into that about CDBG-DR and things like that and what you have to consider in order to use those funds. But we'll get into all of this in more detail. So recovery activities involve the restoration of impacted services and areas to pre-disaster conditions. These activities can be short-term, intermediate, and long-term, which can range from restoring essential services to mitigation measures, which again we've discussed, that would be designed to prevent future occurrences or at least to mitigate or lower the actual impact of the disaster. Among other things, successful recovery will involve overcoming physical, emotional, and environmental impacts of the disaster. And you might be required to rebuild and integrate the functional needs of all of your residents. So it's not just recovering and putting in, new units or replacing the units. You have to consider your residents in the community as well. And this is also important to reduce your portfolio's vulnerability to hazards. So that's something we're just going to keep going back to as well, the mitigation and the resiliency aspect. Yeah. Oh, you go back a little thing. Oh. One that starts with wants, needs, and resources have been identified. Yes. So in the beginning, we talked about creating your D3R action plan, your disaster readiness plan, your COOP, all kind of referring to the same thing. So you would use that throughout the response and recovery process. But in the recovery phase, there's an additional plan that federal funding agencies and HUD recommends that PHAs implement, which is known as a Recovery Support Strategy Plan, or RSS. So this is something that essentially all federal agencies use during recovery efforts, and it's encouraged that PHAs do the same thing. And you'll see in the D3R guidebook from HUD that they ask that you consider implementing something like this. Different agencies and localities might already have something like this. You guys might have something like this and just call it something different. But really the goal in this plan or this strategy is to rehouse your residents and reestablish your portfolio. So some best practices to consider during recovery, and we'll touch on some of these. Assessing recent events, implementing opportunities to increase or incorporate post-disaster climate adaptation. I think this is something that we've kind of been talking around, but with climate potentially changing and events getting more extreme, that's also something to consider. And, you know, we see in the news how there's 1,000-year floods happening in unexpected areas. So even if you are near a 100-year floodplain, that doesn't necessarily mean a whole lot now. It's probably guaranteed to flood. So that's another thing to consider. And that's another aspect on the environmental considerations. Next slide. All right, so the goal of your RSS, there's some overarching goals and some information that should be detailed in your RSS. But essentially what it is a roadmap for your PHA to identify funding, maximize the return on investment, and includes different activities that will help you reach your ultimate recovery goals. So rather than it being kind of an abstract idea of what you have to get back to or an idea of what it used to be like, this is going to really delineate and define what you consider to be recovery and help you break down the tasks and steps necessary to get to that goal. So some of the decisions and priorities that you've made early in the response and recovery process will have a cascading effect in the rest of your recovery efforts. So that's why it can be important to consider a strategy. So short-term recovery generally begins concurrently with the response phase or shortly after the conclusion of the response. Those activities will generally occur within 90 days of the incident. You'll see in HUD and FEMA, they will generally say that the short-term recovery is usually between 0 and 6 months. So in some cases, you might be implementing recovery very shortly after response has concluded, and sometimes your response period is going to be extended if there's a major disaster. And kind of as we've gone over, the roadmap itself, the RSS, will detail your overarching goals for returning to pre-disaster state and defining how you envision that, creating timelines and lengths of time to accomplish each of your more small tasks, the responsible parties that you've identified for each of these steps. So it kind of sounds like a coup, like as we're talking about it, right? So it sounds like a coup, but it's really just focused on recovery. It should focus on one thing versus that really comprehensive coup. And it also include your identification of communication strategies with your residents and with your stakeholders. So as I've said, the short-term recovery is 0 to 6 months generally. And it will really include whatever actions are needed to like fully stabilize the situation. So that's your short-term recovery goal, is making sure things are stabilized, you've restored your essential services, your staff can execute all of their essential functions, and you can begin the process of restoring your property. So you can't move too fast when you're in that response phase. You have to make sure everything is kind of settled before you move into recovery. The intermediate phase generally is considered the 6 to 12 month. Oh, sorry, can we go back a bit more? Thank you. So just this last bullet point, intermediate phase is about 6 to 12 months, and it involves returning your property to a functional but not necessarily pre-disaster state. Why it's called intermediate. So some of these activities are temporary actions that are going to start bridging the distance, bridging the gap between your short-term recovery and your long-term recovery. And those long-term activities are going to be those that are necessary to actually restore it to its pre-disaster state. And this is the area or the phase in your RSS plan that requires a lot of planning, a lot of consideration. Because what you're trying to do is you're trying to maximize opportunities for recovery. You're trying to coordinate all the different funding sources, and you're trying to identify opportunities for resilience. So it really is a larger and longer term effort. Before I move on to kind of the descriptions of the short, intermediate, and long term, has anybody developed something similar to this? Have something in their head that they thought about for this? For the recovery effort? Are you guys still kind of in your response?
And these, like 0 to 6 to 6 to 12, this was just in the guidebook as defined by HUD, but it really is very flexible, like what you've experienced and how it looks for your future.
Yeah, it's more just defining like the timing among the phases versus like the concrete timing. It's not always going to be 6 to 12 months.
Or
So-
multi-family housing and like LIHTC, they kind of make us do that anyway. So we had to plan out for like our landings, which is multi-family PA.
Yeah.
Or PRA. We've had to say, here, what's gonna take a year, what's gonna take this time, you know, how are we gonna get back? And we have to send out the phases.
Okay.
So,
Yeah, so it sounds like it would be similar. Yeah, and you know, one option would be to create something like this and just incorporate it into your COOP. So you have your COOP, your readiness plan, and then you have all of your response activities, and then you can start referring to your RSS, recovery support strategy. So here we just have some examples of what short-term recovery will look like. So you're evaluating and whenever necessary, reestablishing your PHA's administrative operations. Some cases, it sounds like you guys aren't super impacted, but if you lose internet, if you have staff who are unavailable, if you can't access your administrative building, short-term recovery is going to focus on getting back to more normal. You'll also be identifying or providing temporary housing for any displaced residents. You're going to be conducting your damage assessments and debris removal and identifying in that process what's needed to return your units and your portfolio to a habitable condition. So here's, oh, sorry, we go forward one. Forward one more. Thank you. Okay, so here's just some additional examples of what short-term recovery can include. Documenting your expenses and damages. It really sounds like all of you are pretty familiar with all of these, but one thing I wanted to point out is encouraging PHA residents to take advantage of FEMA IA. So we know you're not FEMA, we know you guys aren't going to be FEMA experts, but it can be helpful to familiarize yourself with some of the application process because you probably will have residents coming to you asking for help or having questions, and just having a basic understanding of it can be really helpful because your residents do rely on you. So the intermediate recovery, as you can kind of guess, is the shortest phase. So this phase, again, you're just trying to bridge that gap until you can reach the long-term recovery. So you might be identifying your capacity, your resources. You might be deciding to update your response and recovery plans. And if you've identified specific partnerships that might require some sort of legal agreement with another PHA, another agency, this would be the time to formalize those relationships, like an MOU, MOA, something like that, where you have a specific agreement with established terms.
And this is a good time and a good point in your recovery. So as soon as you're, what is it? It's like storming, warming, and warming for free. Anyway, so all right, you know what I'm talking about. But I think that so once the event is happening and you're past the exigent circumstance, then this is really the time when you should start thinking about those long-term resiliency projects and how you might fund them, right? So start looking at where the CDBG money is coming, where the mitigation funds are coming, the hazard funds. Look at the state, look at your county, your city. Who is an entitlement? If you sit in an entitlement community, that means that funding's going to come directly to that city or county. So start to put in your needs. Here's our needs assessment. By the way, we need, you know, if the county or city is considering a broadband project, we have these areas that are kind of, you know, what is it, they're called like a Wi-Fi. It's like a Wi-Fi desert. they have that throughout the country as well, right? Like kind of like a food desert.
Yeah.
And so the first thing that goes down are those communities that are most affected by disaster. Think in those terms, right? Because if there's an existing project that's happening, you may want it to include your community or to become close to your communities, right? And most projects are incentivized to assist not only with those that are, but not only with areas of counties and cities that were most affected or impacted in terms of infrastructure, but also those that service the most impacted citizens, like very low to low income members of the community. So you're well positioned. I know Earl's gonna jump in here. I can see you taking. So you're well positioned to start like if there anything infrastructure, bridges, roads, housing developments. This is when, you know, developers will come in to replace single family housing. There might be some sort of provision where a certain percentage has to go to like an inclusionary housing ordinance like we put in place. We start advocating both at like the policy levels and the project level. And wait, Earl said, he has the most experience with it.
Catherine is exactly right. So most of your housing authorities may fall within what's called the most impacted and distressed areas for the storm. Like when you get the presidentially declared disaster, they'll identify the mids. They call it the mid counties, or the counties that have been impacted the most. And 80% of CDBG-DR dollars must be spent in the mid area. So this is where it comes where you guys really start to formulate what are the projects that you need. What are the local projects that you may want to support that may help with stormwater drainage? All of the things that will directly impact your area, you may want to look into what the county may be doing in those areas and to provide your input. But there's also a time for you to get your little wish list together and say, hey, we have these resilient activities, we have these mitigating activities, and we have an unmet need to address them. So it may be your time to insert the housing authority's needs into that plan, because in each action plan, there is a section on public housing, on what are the public housing needs. So you want to be at the forefront and say, hey, these are our needs, like we talked about yesterday. It's not time to pull up in the bed and just say, just change the oil. If you need an engine, say you need an engine. And so it's one of those things that, you know, you want to be able to tell your story and tell your full story on how you were impacted, how you responded, and what do you need to recover, to adequately recover, and to be resilient for the next time.
Yeah.
And I'll get into CDBG-DR a little bit later. But one important thing is to be part of that conversation. So one of the key goals is to have 51% LMI for all projects. So you have the information that your city and the county need. You have that demographic, you have the residents. So being part of that conversation so that you have things that benefit your community. And like I said, your demographic as well. So we're doing it.
Yeah, so these are all really great points that are being made, and I think kind of goes to show all of these things that we've been talking about coming together, being prepared ahead of time, being able to articulate your needs and demonstrate what your needs are, being organized and having all of your documentation together and all of your before and after photos, and then leveraging those partnerships and those relationships that you've either built beforehand or you've built through the process of responding to a disaster together. And like Danielle was alluding to, these partnerships can be really helpful when you're trying to get your voice in, when they're having these discussions about what kind of long-term recovery projects there will be. Your voice is very important, and making sure that you're at those meetings, those community outreach events, that you come prepared with what you need, that you can, you know, provide to whoever it is that's putting together that action plan, which I don't know how familiar everyone is with CDBG-DR and the requirement for an action plan, but essentially, as we've been saying, either the state or the entitlement city would receive funding, and they're the ones who have to document everything that they plan to do with the CDBG-DR funding, and then it's submitted to HUD for HUD's approval. So that whole process is when it's very important to get in there, because after that action plan is established, you know, you kind of don't have an opportunity to grab any of that funding. But while that action plan is being written and they're deciding how to use the funds, that is when you really want to be in there and get your projects and your needs in there. We go one slide. So long-term recovery. Long-term recovery can actually last for years. So we have 12 months and longer. I'm pretty sure Katrina is still wrapping up, like it's not closed yet. So, you know, it is a long-term process. It is a marathon. But just to kind of briefly go over what this phase is defined as under an RSS. You're gonna be building capacity for your recovery, so making sure that you have the staff that you need, the resources that you need, the federal funding agency relationships, and so on. You're gonna be likely identifying what's needed to either reconstruct or repair your portfolio and your facilities. Rebuilding units potentially, finding new units, exchanging residents, and restoring the administrative functioning of your offices to pre-disaster levels. So that's kind of what we're talking about from an operations level. And then when possible, recovering disaster-related costs from different federal funding agencies. So again, that's coming back to keeping all your documentation, keeping organized, because, you know, if FEMA denies you, it's possible you can get funding from elsewhere. So again, restoring business operations. The goal here is to fully establish your pre-disaster operations, restoring all the essential functions that either might not have been done previously, or maybe another staff member has been covering in the interim. And using your COOP will really help you to navigate this whole process, because you guys have already been through a lot in that response phase. So getting into this recovery phase, it helps to be able to refer back to something in writing that you established or wrote when you weren't in emergency mode. You can lean on that and rely on that, and it will help during the recovery process. And it'll also help you to prioritize the way you need to prioritize. Earl, did you have anything?
In this space, when you talk about just kind of reestablishing your operation, you have to think about not only how you operate it, but it's almost like you're running an assessment of, okay, where are our gaps? And in this time, this is the way you fill in the gaps. You know, we know how the disaster impacted us. We know what we did. Where did we drop the ball? So, and you know, you have to put yourself in that mindset to do that assessment. But 9 times out of 10, you're doing it in real time. So one of the things that you have to train yourself to understand is, you know, I have to do this evaluation and assessment on the fly. Early in disaster recovery, we call this period, you know, you're designing the plane, building the plane, and flying it at the same time. And so we've moved away from that, because at this time, you know, we've done this so many times before in disaster recovery. It's almost as if right now we've designed the plane, we built the plane. Now we're deciding where we're going with the plane. And so we want you to understand that sometimes it may not be time for you to think about some of those things, but it's time for you to think about those things. So I'm gonna say that again, so it really sticks. It may not be time for you to think about those things, but it's time for you to think about those things. You may be doing 9 or 10 different other things, but you have to think about those things, and where did we drop the ball? How do we get better? Because you want to be able to move forward in the next time. And then when it talks about using your COOP, you know, that's an opportunity. Where did I drop the ball? What can I do to get better? What training did I go to pick up a nugget of information that can help me get better for the next time? And so those are the things that you have to ask yourself, really starting today. You know, some of you guys have been through some disasters, and now you're putting it to work. Now you ask yourself those questions: how do I get better? One quick anecdote is that after Katrina, there were three major disaster grantees: Mississippi, Louisiana, and Texas. So immediately after Katrina, we were all constantly on them, and this is at HUD. When I was at HUD, we would go out to monitor them, and we would always go in with one finding that we knew that we were already right up, that they didn't have an administrative manual on what to do and how to do it. We knew it right off the bat. They didn't have it because they were in recovery mode, so they didn't have time to write it. But we had to put it on their mind. This is a priority. You have to get it done. You have to get it done. You have to get it done. And so And they kept asking us, well, why are you giving us this finding? You know we don't have time to do it. Why are you giving us the finding? Because we want to get on the forefront of their mind. And so what happens is they did the administrative manual and boom, what happened? Here come Ike and Gustav. 2 more storms back to back. When Ike and Gustav came through, they had the administrative manual, they were up and ready, they knew what to do, and they were up. But the benefit of that was that, okay, when Sandy hit in New York, New Jersey, and New York City, they were able to call Louisiana and Texas and say, okay, what do we do? Here's the administrative manual on what you need to do. They're able to pick it up and run with it. So that's some of the stuff that we try and import in your mind. And sometimes it may not be time to think about it, but it is time to think about it. So just so you can get your priority list in order on what you need to do. So those are just some of the things that this training can kind of help you think about and how to move forward in restoring your business operation. But as we go through it, it'll be a couple more things that come up.
Thanks, Earl.
Thank you.
Sorry.
We need no more leads.
Oh, yeah. Yes. I mean, that is a great point, and it kind of goes back to what we have been talking about of sharing best practices and lessons learned. There are going to be other agencies, like you just said, there's agencies on the East Coast calling Louisiana, like they don't have the exact same disaster. They're not even located in the same area of the US, but there are strategies, resources, ideas, lessons learned, that you can take advantage of from someone who has been in a similar position.
Yeah, and anyone who's received CDBG DR funding has a website and their action plans are on there. So if you want to go through and see what the public housing submissions typically look like, that's a good idea too. And you can look up Hurricane Maria or Florida hurricanes, and you'll see their action plans are posted on their website.
Yep.
The action plans and those administrative manuals are on there also.
Yeah.
And, you can look up their reports and see what projects you can have done. Specifically, some of them have some of their public housing projects.
Yeah.
So you guys can look at that and look at that also.
Yes.
Give you some ideas on what to bother your local officials about.
Yeah, so the action plans that you can find for CDBG-DR are extremely detailed. You're gonna have a lot of information and they're required to be posted publicly. So if you can think of somewhere that was affected by disaster and you look up that location, the disaster's name and action plan, you're gonna find the documentation they submitted to HUD, and you might even be able to use some of those ideas for your own PHA.
So tend to, I guess, the local industry group meetings, the knowledge block of those. How many of you attend those? How many of you attend the national?
How many of you attended like the narrow groups, like the?
Florida will be far right. Yeah.
We attend the farm.
Have any of you ever attended the national ones?
Yeah. Yeah, I think.
Have these same conversations at those industry group meetings, because you're already talking to your counterparts. And they can say, oh, I've already been through that, but simply saying, do New York contact that email. And that was because it was still more recent, but we're going to the industry group meetings anyway, while you're having lunch. Ask one of the housing authorities that may have been through something or share your experience for both. So make sure you just make use of all of these networking connections that's already available to you, especially if you're paying membership fees. Definitely make use of.
Yes. Yeah, that's a great point. Thank you. Next slide, please. So maybe not step one, but very high up there is making sure your staffing is where it needs to be as you work on restoring business operations. So I'm sure many of you can attest a disaster can affect your staff directly. They might be impacted at their homes, their families might be impacted. But then at work, if they're helping you to respond, if they're part of your continuity team, their job duties are going to be affected. The expectations that you're putting them will be affected. And so we talked about, leadership is displaced. What is the activation plan for the next person? What is the hierarchy? And one thing that I'm sure is obvious is when you're recovering from a disaster is identifying which staff you have available, what their assigned duties are, and whether you need to reassign any duties for that recovery effort. So if, depending on staff availability and capabilities, it's possible you need to move people into a new role. It's possible you need to roll some additional responsibilities onto someone. And in the next slide, we'll talk about how a disaster will increase, I would assume, everyone's job responsibilities. Everybody's going to be working more. And one thing to keep in mind is you don't want to overburden your staff. You don't want to burn them out. And you don't want to burn out yourself either. So something to consider is if you need additional staffing. You might want to consider hiring temporary staff. If you have an existing contract from before the disaster, leveraging that and seeing if you can bring on some staff to assist, maybe with the recovery efforts, but maybe with the job duties that aren't getting done because everybody is so busy. You could procure a contract service to fill any of those staffing gaps, and something else that you could potentially do is establishing an MOU or some sort of agreement with a neighboring PHA to loan you staff. So in our last session, we actually had a couple of examples of people loaning each other staff after the emergency because staff weren't available, they were really stretched thin and needed help. So just something to consider that is something that people. Has anybody had experience with that? Anybody loan staff, other PHAs? You did? Oh, okay.
Really? I have a question. I know that like on the DR side, if you have nonprofits that are assisting with your recovery, and this is a FEMA question, because I was thinking, you have nonprofits that are nonprofit or volunteer staff that are assisting with certain projects or programs, you can be reimbursed right through DR. Does FEMA work the same way? So if you're sharing staff, does that help with your? Are you reimbursed?
FEMA reimbursed for emergency protective services, as well as any document, like if you're working on replacing a road, you have to document your hours for reimbursement. Get submitted for reimbursement.
So you can't, so even for staff.
Yeah.
Good to know.
And they'll also reimburse for hourly employees, the overtime for it too. So if you had hourly employees that were working 12, 13, 14 hours, as long as it's
Right, so,
documented.
and how did you got, so we put a few plans that used to have like PeopleSoft and like 7 different systems, like ADP, or in Excel.
Yeah.
Like good old Excel
Yeah,
sheet,
we
right?
had to document it by we asked for check stubs, their employees' check stubs, the employee handbook. They wanted that.
Okay.
They wanted work orders. It was task driven. So we had to create like work orders, like what were they doing during those overtime hours, in addition to their regular hours. Salaried employees were exempt. It was just only for hourly,
Exempt, like not eligible,
not eligible.
because they're paid out of another.
Yeah, salary. So. Right.
Their regular.
Yeah, so yes, somebody could be held somewhere else without them.
Right.
But that's something they do, it's part of the current staff within their daily workday. Right?
Okay, yeah, thank you. Okay, good. Thanks, Earl. Yeah, this is good.
Okay.
So another aspect of restoring business operations is if your office or administrative buildings are not accessible, identifying what's needed to make them usable again. And kind of like we've talked about in the past, anticipating that you might not have access to your offices can be helpful. If you already have certain remote work practices in place, if you have mobile phones and laptops for your staff, or at least a way for them to access the files or what they need to when they're off-site, can be really helpful in facilitating the return to business operations. Next slide, please. And so if you are impacted, you can't use your administrative buildings, you can't use your offices, and you also don't have an alternative space identified. Here's where those local partnerships will come in handy again. You can ask community partners if they have any alternative locations for your operations. A couple of examples we have here are fire halls, community centers, libraries. But you also might have neighboring PHAs who might not have been impacted, or they might have enough space to say, move into our second floor, you guys can take over and do all of your normal day-to-day operations from there. I think we actually heard that in Jacksonville, that a building that wasn't affected as much as another neighboring PHA, they had their staff move to one of their other offices and they invited the impacted PHA, right? Okay, yeah. So they invited the impacted PHA into their administrative offices so they can continue working and providing services. Next slide, please. So disaster waivers. Anybody familiar with disaster waivers? No? Anybody heard of disaster waivers before? No? Okay.
Like be flexible, what we're required to, like administrative work or anything that you're reporting,
Yeah.
extra additional time.
Yes, so they're,
The waivers they had for COVID,
what was that?
as much like the waivers they had for.
Yes,
COVID,
exactly.
Regarding they do that.
Right, so there would be something issued in a federal register notice that will say for those impacted by a certain disaster, here are maybe certain flexibilities or extensions on timing, or, you know, you don't even have to do this requirement if you were affected by it and you're named in the federal register notice. So that is another thing to keep in mind in the recovery efforts is there's a federal register notice that's been issued. Familiarize yourself with that, see what you might not have to do, what the expectations are, and so on.
Read the Federal Register notice. Just read it. Sometimes, you know, you have to read it multiple times. There's
Very
a lot
dry.
of,
Very
Just-
dry.
Very dry.
there's a lot of information in those. Yeah.
Yeah.
So, and it's divided up into sections, so your attention can be called to the house right away. All of you will list out the waivers.
And you can look at like old federal register notices for previous disasters. It'll have all of the information that we're talking about on there. So you can see kind of the types of things that might be waived, or there might be flexibilities, like they said with COVID. So you can take a look if you ever have an hour before bed that you want to fall asleep, or you can read that.
Like sometimes, for example, a waiver would surround, the area. So then the thing is certain level, you could exceed like 120 the area.
Everybody hear that?
Useful, no. Sorry, it would be, so like, for example, I know one of the waivers that I've seen a number of times has to do with very immediate income. So it's everybody that's been impacted by the disaster. And they'll say you can exceed 120% of area immediate income to help residents. So if you have a high concentration of, let's say, HCV properties in one area, that might be like, just kind of keep that in mind, because if there's an infrastructure project or you help those landlords, either a rehab and repair project, something like that, that the city or county is running, they might qualify for that.
So just a little more context to that. If there's a waiver for low to moderate income requirements, that might be talking about CDBG-DR, where it has very specific requirements on the percentage that you have to assist using those funds. So Catherine's referring to a waiver where it says, rather than limiting you to only assisting people, say at 80%, they might bump it up to 120%, just because of the demographics, or, you know, just how things have worked out. Yeah, or because they might think like.
Because I'm saying is don't let that deter you, because there's still, there's still normally the DR can fund more funding function. And like the last few properties I've seen, the housing has come first. So.
Yeah. Good hand?
Yeah, I was just gonna say, that was an excellent point about the Federal Register. Typically, they're a little bit daunting. But one of the things that typically happens when something like this occurs is there's an associated PIH notice. And one of the things that me and my team will often do is we will look at that Federal Register. We will gather around the round table and extrapolate all of the important parts out and send it out to the affected PHA so it's a little bit more sincere. And we also collaborate with CPD, which is the funding source for those CDBG funds as well. So we can also assist our PHAs in understanding that language without having to read all of
Yes,
the
okay.
unnecessary information.
Yes, thank you for pointing that out. And I think that might have been a point we've missed is coordinate with your local field office, ask questions. If you're confused, if you're overwhelmed, talk to your field office. They have people who are experts, they have policy experts and people who
They
are
know
doing
who wrote
analysis.
it.
What was that?
They know who wrote it.
Yeah. They know who wrote it, they probably know where it came from. So yeah, use your field
They
office.
put in
as
the
a
comments
resource.
and revise.
Yep. All right, next slide.
Just think about you getting the clip notes straight from Cliff.
So here's what, I think we've laid out a graphic of submitting a waiver request for a disaster. One thing that we would note is waivers are not automatically granted. They have to be requested by the PHA. And they have to be requested within 120 days of the presidentially declared disaster. So something to keep in mind if you have your COOP or you're trying to assess what your timing and priorities are, making sure if you think that a waiver is necessary, that it's submitted within that time period and you don't miss the deadline is important to keep in mind. So yeah, we have this graphic. You can refer to the checklist. I think we have links to this in the deck.
Yeah, I added the FEMA link.
Okay. So yeah, you would be completing the information. Oh, can we go back one? Thank you. Completing the information, submitting it as indicated, emailing to the email address we have up here. We'll have all of this information in the deck. There'll be links. This is kind of just demonstrating what that process looks like. And there's also we have a website that links to an example of HUD's expedited process for waivers and flexibilities and the requirements for doing so. So take a look at all of that after the training. Next slide, please. There are a couple of things that HUD is never going to waive, and we've listed some of them here: fair housing requirements, civil rights requirements, labor standards, environmental review. So there are some flexibilities and there are areas where you can ask for a waiver, but these are areas that are always going to be required. Something to keep in mind. Next slide. All right, as we're continuing in our disaster recovery, getting our staffing capacity up, restoring our business operations. We're also rehousing displaced residents, which I'm sure is at the top of everyone's mind. So one thing that you'll have to do pretty much immediately is identifying who has been displaced and who needs immediate shelter. Do all of you have some sort of tracking mechanism for all of your residents, their phone numbers, their units, who's living with them, their emergency contact? Everybody have that somewhere?
Yes.
Yes. So this can be really helpful because as you respond, you're in the response phase and the recovery phase of the disaster, being able to refer back to that and checking off, okay, they're in their house, they're good. Okay, they're living with a friend, they've gone to a hotel, whatever it is, and then identifying who you haven't made contact with or who has been displaced so you can focus on those residents. And I'm sure as many of you can imagine, the rehousing options can vary depending on the disaster. There might be other people not in PHAs who are also affected. So it really is a matter of identifying who has the most need, prioritizing those, working with your federal funding agencies, working with, go ahead.
I have a question.
Sure.
The topic of housing. As we all know, we're living in an environment where affordable housing is very hard. Our families are struggling to find affordable housing. And the inventory is extremely limited. So in a hurricane, now I'm speaking to everybody, Ali, in a hurricane where structure and homes and apartments and available affordable housing is limited, how are we going to rehouse our families?
And these are discussions that we need to continue to have.
Yeah.
Because, okay, HUD works with us with giving us the flexibility to increase our payment standards and to make it affordable for our residents, but our residents are currently struggling to find affordable housing.
Yeah.
So what can we do?
Anyone have any suggestions?
That's outside of the housing authority's control. That goes up to the governor.
Yeah, but us
As far as
this is our job. We're supposed
Yeah.
to be helping our families and advocate for our residents. Yes, is an upper level impacted, upper authority, responsibility, but it's also, this is our day-to-day responsibility. And what do we tell our residents? These are families that are looking for housing. They can't find it.
I know, it's the same problem. And
And we
especially
are
after a
having the
disaster,
same problem.
especially after a disaster.
Yeah.
Well, one of the things, and I think I mentioned this on yesterday, is that we can always, and that's a very valid concern, but one of the things you might want to do is making sure your policy allows for individuals to immediately put out. You know, oftentimes they may not be able to find something locally, but believe it or not, you'll find some of your residents perhaps want to put someplace
Yes.
else. So having that flexibility can answer some of that. It may not be a cure-all, but it can at least address some of it.
Yeah, and that's actually suggested in the D3R guidebook,
Yeah.
and we're about to hit it in 2 slides. Portability of HCV.
Yeah, we've had, when we were impacted, a lot of our residents were ported out of state, but it's a new environment now.
Yeah.
We have people coming to the state of Florida, and they're limited housing here. And even if they go out of the state, where are they gonna find housing that's affordable? These are discussions that I'm having with staff, I'm having with colleagues, I'm having with other executive directors, and it's.
Development.
Yeah.
So like, for example, DR funds can be used for new multifamily development.
Yes.
And there are, there are price, you can put I'm sorry, you can put parameters in place, so like within certain income bands, some of the units need to be very low,
We're working now on a project that we layered 25 PVP.
very.
Our city, my city, have no land. They have no land available.
So there are also, to Jackie's point, intergovernmental agreements and MOUs. So oftentimes counties and cities will band together with DR funds to say there's a regional need. And so we're going to develop so many new units of affordable multifamily housing.
We're going to the state
We're going to the
and
state.
making the case to the state.
To the state and saying we want to use our DR funds for single family new development because these homes have been bought out or folks can't move back into these multifamily housing units. And so there'll be a mortgage assistance program to meet these, to meet your residents where they need to, maybe each even purchase a home. So there are a number of, but again, that would be DR.
I can voice my concern, just wanted to share my concern.
No, I think, to your point, if you have a group that's come together for like a regional group, yes, go to the state, go to the county or the city that's receiving the funding and say, look, we need, based on our unmet needs, our needs assessment, we are short X number of affordable units within these brackets.
And here's the demand.
And here's the
Here's
demand.
what we currently have unhoused.
Unhoused. And so that's what goes into a report and that's what goes into a report for funding consideration. And when you, again, advocate for yourselves, for your residents, that's when those projects get developed, right? So handing over the unmet needs is wonderful, but saying, look, now we need a project of X number of units will help fulfill this need. And it's not just for Delray, it's a regional concern.
Yeah.
And this is another thing that you can look in action plans of other impacted cities and counties. You will see this exact type of project of increasing the number of affordable housing units.
We're happy to send you examples too.
It's community awareness too. You have to educate your city council, your county commissioners. so they understand what the full impact is. I
They
mean,
already understand.
So we were instrumental, like in Charlotte County, to actually have Charlotte County commissioners set aside, it's called Charlotte County Housing Trust Funds, to incentivize affordable housing developers to come in to actually develop. And we actually were able to, county owns a lot of land, actually to take huge parcel and put it out for competitive process for affordable housing. So I think it starts with your local, your affordable housing advisory committee to go to your city and your county.
It depends on the market too.
Yeah.
So if you know that construction loans aren't being, right, you know, the developers need to. That's the time to really go to push for those sort of policies or inclusionary ordinances. Because developers will say, well, look, this is a guaranteed funding, so
Right.
I know I can get my development.
Earl, you wanted to make a point?
And, that statement about affordable housing is one that's happening across the country.
Yes.
And it's definitely one that, the collective voice is much stronger than housing authorities going in ones and twos. So, and that's where, participating in forward and coming to an agreement saying, hey, this is something that we need to push for, across the state. The state has action plans where they have, billions of dollars in disaster allocations. Let's look at how we appropriate those funds for affordable housing or affordable housing projects throughout the most impacted and distressed areas. So, that's where that collective voice can really make an impact.
Right.
And it would actually increase that affordable housing section or that housing authority section from a couple paragraphs to a couple pages in the action plan. And so in that collective voice makes all the difference in the world, because it's harder to tell a group of folk no than ones and twos. So you have to make that collective voice known. And to your point about the local a local community effort, we have to re-educate folk about what affordable housing is. And so, you have some people that you say affordable housing and they completely over their head. They don't understand that they are a recipient for affordable housing. And so, affordable housing, we all in the same boat, we all deal with the same clientele. Some words get the taboo, the taboo stigma, Section 8 for a while, got the taboo stigma, and now affordable housing is one that, it has, this whole stigma associated with affordable housing, and folks really need to be re-educated on what affordable housing is and what affordable housing means. Because too many people are falling by the wayside because their housing is not affordable. And so, but it adversely impacts the clients that we serve day-to-day because of how it's viewed, and there's no community support for pushing affordable housing initiatives, and we have to change that now collectively.
Right.
Great, thank you. So on the rehousing of your displaced residents topic, this can really be expedited if you already have policies in place that address this. One example is disaster preference policy or transfer policy. And show of hands again, who has a disaster preference policy in place? Okay, great. Did you do that before or after your, before? And did you have to rehouse anyone?
Thankfully, no, because we hardened our projects after Hurricane Charlie.
Okay,
But that's okay. I don't worry.
Yeah, the metal roof.
did you have to rehouse anyone using that policy?
We house, yes.
So you're able to use the disaster preference policy? It worked well for you? That's great.
In our project, what gave us 200 relocation vouchers.
Was that helpful?
But we're.
Very helpful.
Right, and I think I saw another hand. Someone else had, you did?
We have the policy, but we didn't have
You
to
didn't have to use it? Okay. Does anybody had to rehouse someone and did not have a disaster preference policy? Does anybody had to rehouse residents after disaster?
Yeah, we had, most of us, I think, have that preference in our, so
Do.
that with the FHFC allowing, us not getting lights that we were able to stop, coming to the waiting list and actually move our residents into, housing. We don't have to make that back.
Okay, yeah, so it sounds like everybody's gonna be prepared.
This is a question for HUD. Let's say that a housing authority gets caught off guard and doesn't have a preference in place. What should they do? What are their next steps? If they need to create housing authority?
They need to convene a board meeting and.
Immediately amend the policy, call a special meeting and amend your policy to.
Right away.
Get preference.
Yeah,
Yeah.
very important.
And Jackie. Because we don't want a fair housing issue by skipping that wait list without having that policy in place. But we tend to try to get that information out to our PHAs in advance of situations like this. In fact, we communicated that to all of the Florida PHAs. I think back in last hurricane that affected the Virgin Islands. We got that information out there. These are in your policies, and we were able to assist a lot of those individuals who had the 3 hours to come to the mainland.
In these trainings, have you come across any PHA that didn't have it in there, or it was impacted, that there are some
Yeah.
in Florida that didn't.
And they struggled.
Yeah.
Earl?
It's, one thing that, in rehousing displaced residents, the PHAs, they have to have the information, and we talked about that coordination with FEMA. You may get some instances where, PHAs have been impacted to where, some of your clients may have gone into the hotel program, or going into, receive rental assistance from FEMA. So you have to understand that song and dance that happens between the PHA and FEMA, so you don't get into that double dip situation. And a lot of that happens like with your housing choice voucher, recipients, where they may have gone to the hotel program while the unit is being repaired. And then there's this coordination between the landlord, the housing authority, and FEMA to say, okay, the unit is now habitable, this person can move back in, so they're no longer eligible for the hotel program. So it's just having that level of coordination and understanding that, hey, my clients are eligible for individual assistance. And so some PHAs don't have that knowledge, but when a disaster happens, that FEMA number goes around real quick, and folk call the number and get registered, and before you know it, they get an IA check or something, or something to help them along, and then they may be signed up for multiple programs that have been turned on. And so there's that coordination that, okay, this is a housing authority client, but those questions are being asked in the JFOs. Okay, HUD, are you taking care of your people? And so, and that's how they'll ask the HUD representatives in the JFO, are you taking care of your people? And so we have to have that coordination between, and that's when you start getting the calls from the housing, from HUD asking you, how many people were displaced, how many people were impacted? And so all that feeds back into the questions that are being asked about how many folk have been displaced, how many people are on the FEMA program versus the voucher program, to avoid that whole double dip situation. So do understand that, your clients are eligible for those services, but it has to be that coordinated effort to make sure you don't get into that type of situation.
It's a coordinated effort, because one of the things that happens is we receive a list from FEMA bi-weekly, sometimes more often, asking us to contact PHA to check to see if these individuals have been displaced. Now, it's not necessarily related to the individual cash assistance, because that's something totally separate.
Right.
But for the displacement, and we did find quite a few, which is why Harry asked your question yesterday. We found quite a few individuals who were not displaced, but were in fact receiving housing assistance.
Yeah. And that, I think, is sometimes because FEMA is going door to door,
Absolutely.
asking like, were you impacted? Do you need assistance? You're like, yeah, I need assistance.
Right.
And on the other side of that, we also found that, some of our HCD clients had been displaced and we weren't made aware of it.
Mhm.
The
Yeah.
client never called us, the landlord never called us. So the half payments are continuing to go out, but the clients in a hotel
Yes.
being paid for by FEMA.
Yep.
Um,
Yes, very good points. So just a couple more points I want to make on this slide, and we've got a couple more minutes, then we're going to go to break. So thank you for sticking through this long portion of the training. So it sounds like everybody has already done this, but just want to reiterate, if you have a disaster preference policy, make sure it's formally described in your ACOP and HCB admin plan. Any local preferences have to be consistent with your plan, where your jurisdiction is. And then kind of like we touched on before, if you do have displaced residents, sounds like everybody has the ability to, track and document all their residents, but you're specifically displaced residents, make sure you have a mechanism for tracking where they are. If they have an interest in a voucher, if they have an interest in being rehoused, some of them may opt to leave the program or give up their voucher. So just making sure you have some sort of centralized way of documenting that information, so you're following up on those displaced residents, because that is still a responsibility of the PHA. So something to keep in mind. All right, we've got, we're almost there. Next slide. Hey, we kind of talked about HCV portability and vouchers. Does anybody have any questions on that? Okay, next slide. So kind of touched on all of this, but if you identify a displaced resident, your primary objective is to reestablish permanent housing for them. There's a lot of different ways you can do this. Maintaining a log so that you can keep track of it is important. Leveraging your established partnerships, seeing if people can move PHAs. Next slide. And this has kind of been raised organically. The local housing market can be affected by a disaster. So your residents aren't the only ones impacted. Your PHA is the only one impacted. There can be a lot of pressure on the local market, with a lot of people looking for housing essentially overnight. And it can be out of balance for a while. So temporary housing might be something to consider, while you identify longer term housing for your displaced residents. Next slide. And then we have just a table of some suggestions of potential permanent housing options and temporary housing options. Temporary being directing them to friends and family if they have somewhere safe to stay, non-congregate shelters, community or congregate shelters, or housing options that FEMA might provide. And then more permanent options, if you're able to make repairs, they can return to the unit ideally. If it's uninhabitable and they have half, they might be able to have a voucher reissued to them to relocate. Transfers to other PHAs, or other programs. Has anybody had to do that before for a disaster? Next slide, please.
I have a question. Sure. So if a tenant is already ported out to another housing authority, whose responsibility is to check the status if the tenant is rehoused?
If they're with another housing authority?
Yeah.
And they're transferring to you?
Yeah,
And whose responsibility is,
to make sure he,
it like happens?
yeah.
What?
What's the question?
So, how to make sure this tenant is rehoused?
So they have a tenant from another PHA that is getting transferred to them, so they're getting rehoused in a new PHA. Whose responsibility is it to make sure that tenant,
PHA.
they're receiving?
PHA, certifies the tenant and, make sure that the tenant is housed.
Because
Then they notify the initial PHA that the family has been received in their PHA. And they've executed.
Typically, what we do is, whenever a disaster occurs, we contact all of our PHAs to find out how many vacancies they have available. We ask them to put those vacancies on hold, and there's coordination between the two PHAs.
Yeah.
So there's no issue about double subsidy because we make that transition.
Sure,
between the two
but
PHAs.
ultimately, in this case, it sounds like the receiving PHA is responsible for like getting it over the finish line.
Yes.
Yes. Okay,
Okay, good question.
okay, thank you.
So just a couple of resources here. If you're looking for assistance for your residents who have been displaced, here's some temporary housing options. This will be provided in the deck. Next slide, we kind of addressed already, so next one. And then another option is having the displaced resident utilize FEMA IA. We kind of talked about it already, but CC, did you have anything that you wanted to add on this specific topic, rehousing and FEMA IA?
I think anything for us on it time too. It's communicating that the system exists and coordinating that assistance even does show up and offering individual assistance and status providers. Folks who show up and vote will coordinate those efforts. It'll help prevent the duplication of benefits. It'll make sure that the word gets out. Recommendations get.
Yeah.
You know, we could cause so much chaos and it can often perhaps so easily miss out on assistance. As Gary's pointed out, fraud, when we do prevent the totally really close to the people when they show up. We need most stuff for that kind of local time stuff too. In your community, make sure that you're working with those partnerships. So that all your residents can make sure they access the resources.
Yeah,
Absolutely.
thank you.
Yeah, so I can be proactive in the communication of that, even involving them.
Everybody hear that? Okay. Next slide, please. So we also have this slide. I don't know if there's anything you wanted to add to this. There's 5 primary individual assistance programs under FEMA. The individuals and household programs are the most significant programs because they offer housing and other assistance. The other ones are more supportive services.
You're available. Available to residents. One
Yes.
thing sorry.
No, just.
Well, when I brought up before, and I'll bring them again, so I'm trying to help that partnership with your voluntary organizations or community organizations active in disaster local partnerships. Statewide partnership
Next slide.
to fill in
Thank you.
around them and needs the wraparound, the wraparound services. This is where this whole sequence of delivery of individual assistance starts and with volunteer community organizations, because all disasters start and then locally. So make sure that you're partnering with them. They bring such a wealth of resources to the table, and we're not bound by things like federal renting for obviously. That the services they provide are by the mission partially. So you can get assistance to your residents so quickly. So strongly encourage building your communities for these conversations with your organizations that have been disaster. Florida has very active BOA, so they get partnership with those during the steps too. That's have those partnerships in place. And that way, they're also tied into the FEMA individual system. So they have to be part of the whole partnership.
Thank you. All right. Well, on that note, let's take a 15-minute break. We'll come back. Bring your questions, bring your hypotheticals, and we'll discuss more.
Yes.